Have you ever heard of the horrific punishment of blanketing in the 18th century? In the annals of history, there are stories that shock us, stories that move us, and then there are stories that do both. One such tale is that of Mrs. O'Neill, a courageous mother who embarked on a journey in 1798 that would forever mark her place in the annals of Irish history. From the green pastures of County Antrim, Mrs. O'Neill set off on a mission of love and hope. Her destination, the ominous Geneva Barracks. Her purpose, to visit her beloved son, held captive within its foreboding walls. With a mother's determination and a heart full of courage, she used her wit to bribe the sentries, securing a precious meeting with her son. Yet, unbeknownst to her, this journey of hope would turn into a tale of unspeakable horror. Little did she know, her journey was about to take a tragic turn. Upon her arrival, Mrs. O'Neill was summoned into the presence of Colonel Scott and his wife. In the austere confines of Geneva Barracks, this mother from County Antrim found herself subjected to a rigorous examination. Questions were fired at her, each one more intrusive than the last, the colonel's gaze as cold as the stone walls of the barracks. His wife's scrutiny, no less intimidating, added another layer of discomfort to the already tense atmosphere. But the ordeal didn't end there. Once the barrage of questions ceased, Mrs. O'Neill was handed over to the Highlanders. Now these were not the friendly Highlanders of lore, these were soldiers, hardened by battle and desensitized to cruelty. Their task was to inflict upon Mrs. O'Neill a punishment known as blanketing. A punishment so common, yet so inhumane, that it sends shivers down our spines even today. It involved a blanket and a stripped victim, hoisted into the air repeatedly for everyone to see. Mrs. O'Neill, a woman who had only sought to see her imprisoned son, was subjected to this horrifying punishment for more than 20 minutes. She pleaded for some decency, for some clothes to be left on, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Now you might wonder, what exactly is blanketing? Blanketing is a form of punishment that was common in the 18th century. An ominous term, it conceals a horrifying reality. Imagine a blanket, an ordinary object associated with comfort and warmth, turned into a tool of humiliation and pain. The process was simple, yet chillingly brutal. Soldiers would seize a blanket and strip the victim naked. Now picture Mrs. O'Neill, a mother who had traveled from County Antrim to see her imprisoned son. She found herself amidst a crowd of Highlanders, subjected to this very punishment. Stripped of her dignity and her clothes, she was hoisted into the air repeatedly using the blanket. Her naked body became a spectacle, rising and falling above the walls of Geneva Barracks. For more than 20 minutes, this horrifying scene played out. Mrs. O'Neill, pleading with the soldiers to leave her some shred of decency, was met with cold refusal. Her pleas fell on deaf ears, as Colonel Scott's wife, upon observing this slight deviation from the cruel custom, encouraged her husband to cut off her remaining clothes with his sword. The public humiliation, the physical torment, and the emotional torture of being exposed to a crowd, all of these were components of the inhumane punishment known as blanketing. Mrs. O'Neill's story serves as a stark reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink. But the ordeal didn't end there. The punishment of Mrs. O'Neill took a turn for the worse when Colonel Scott's wife intervened. A grotesque spectacle was about to unfold that would forever mark the pages of history with its inhumanity. As Mrs. O'Neill implored the soldiers for some shred of dignity, the colonel's wife, far from showing any compassion, encouraged her husband to cut off the remaining clothes with his sword. The result was a scene of utter degradation, with Mrs. O'Neill's naked body repeatedly rising and falling above the walls of the barracks, visible to the horrified locals. After enduring this harrowing ordeal, Mrs. O'Neill was taken to Passage East. Her body, weakened by the physical and emotional trauma, could not withstand the ordeal. She passed away the following day, her spirit finally escaping the clutches of her tormentors. The fate of her son remains a mystery. The story of Mrs. O'Neill's tragic end serves as a grim reminder of the cruel injustices of the past.